right. Just getting set up. Talk amongst yourselves. Lovely job. We'll get going. Chapter 16. A Very Frosty Christmas. So Snape was offering to help him, he said defiantly. Offering to help him? If you ask that once more, said Harry, I'm going to stick this sprite. I'm only checking, said Ron. They were standing alone in the Burrows' kitchen sink, at the Burrows' kitchen sink, that is, peeling a mountain of sprouts from Mrs. Weasley. Snow was drifting past the window in front of them. Yes, Snape was offering to help him, said Harry. He said he'd promised Malfoy's mother to protect him, and he'd made an unbreakable oath or something. An unbreakable vow? Said Ron, looking stunned. Nah, he can't have. Are you sure? Yes, I'm sure, said Harry. Why, what does it mean? Well, you can't break an unbreakable vow. I'd worked that much out for myself, funny enough. What happens if you break it then? You die, said Ron simply. Fred and George tried to get me to make one when I was about 5. I nearly did too. I was holding hands with Fred and everything when Dad found us. He went mental, said Ron, with a reminiscent gleam in his eyes. Only time I'd ever seen Dad as angry as Mum. Fred reckons his left buttock's never been the same since. Yes, well, passing over Fred's left buttock. I beg your pardon, said Fred, said Fred's voice as the twins entered the kitchen. Ah, George, look at this. They're using knives and everything. Bless them. I'll be 17 in 2 and a bit months' time, said Ron grumpily. Then I'll be able to do it by magic. But meanwhile, said George, sitting down at the kitchen table and putting his feet up on it, we can enjoy watching you demonstrate the correct use of a whoops-a-daisy. You made me do that, said Ron angrily, sucking his cut thumb. You wait. When I'm 17, I'm sure you'll dazzle us with all hitherto unsuspected magical skills, yawned Fred. And speaking of hitherto unsuspected skills, Ronald, said George, was this we hear from Ginny about you and a young lady called, unless our information is faulty, Lavender Brown? Ron turned pink, but did not look displeased as he turned back to the sprouts. Mind your own business. What a snappy retort, said Fred. I don't really know how you think of them. No, what we want to know is, how did it happen? What do you mean? Did she have an accident or something? What? Well, how did you did she sustain sorry. How did she sustain such extensive brain damage? Careful now. Mrs. Weasley entered the room just in time to see Ron throw a sprout's knife at Fred, who turned it into a paper airplane with one lazy flick of his wand. Ron, she said furiously, don't let me see you throwing knives again. I won't, said Ron. Let you see me, he muttered under his breath as he turned back to the Sprouting Mountain. Fred, George, I'm sorry, dears, but Remus is arriving tonight, so we'll have to squeeze in with you two. No problem, said George. Then, as Charlie isn't coming home, that just leaves Harry and Ron in the attic, and if Fleur shares with Ginny, that'll make Ginny's Christmas, muttered Fred. Everyone should be comfortable. Well, they'll have a bed anyway, said Mrs. Weasley, sounding slightly harassed. Percy's definitely not showing his ugly face then, said Fred. Mrs. Weasley turned away before she answered. No, he's busy, I expect, at the ministry. Or he's the world's biggest prat, said Fred, as Miss Weasley left the kitchen. One of the two. Well, let's get going then, George. What are you two up to? Asked Ron. Can't you help us with these sprouts? You could just use your wand and then we'll be free too. No, I don't think we can do that, said Fred seriously. It's very character building stuff, learning how to peel sprouts without magic. Lets you appreciate how difficult it is for muggles and squibs. And if you want people to help you, Ron, added George, throwing a paper airplane at him. Or added George, throwing the paper airplane at him. I wouldn't chuck knives at them. Just a little hint. Well, we're off to the village. There's a very pretty girl working in the paper shop who thinks my card tricks are something marvellous, almost like real magic. Gits, Ron muttered darkly, watching Fred and George setting off across the snowy yard. Would have only taken them 10 seconds, then we could have gone too. I couldn't, said Harry. I promised Dumbledore I wouldn't wander off while I was staying here. Oh yeah, said Ron. He peeled a few more sprouts and then said, Are you going to tell Dumbledore what you heard Snape and Malfoy saying to each other? Yep, said Harry. I'm going to tell anyone who can put a stop to, and Dumbledore's top of the list. Might have another word with your dad too. But he didn't hear what Malfoy was actually doing, though. I could have done, couldn't I? That was the whole point. He was. Oh, I couldn't have done, could I? That was the whole point. He was refusing to tell Snape. There was a silence for a moment or two. Then Ron said, Of course, you know what they'll all say. Dad and Dumbledore and all of them. They'll say Snape isn't really trying to help Malfoy. He's trying to find out what Malfoy's up to. They didn't hear him, said Harry flatly. No one's that good an actor, not even Snape. Yeah, I'm just saying, though, said Ron. Harry turned his face toward him, frowning. You think I'm right, though? Yeah, I do, said Ron hastily. Seriously, I do. But they're all convinced Snape's in the Order, aren't they? Harry said nothing. It had already occurred to him that this would be the most likely objection to his new evidence. He could hear Hermione now. Obviously, Harry, he was pretending to offer help so he could trick Malfoy into telling him what he was doing. This was pure imagination, however, as he had no opportunity to tell Hermione what he'd overheard. He had disappeared from Slughorn's party before he'd returned to it, or so he'd been informed by an irate McLaggen, and she had already gone to bed by the time he'd returned to the common room. As he and Ron had left for the Burrow early the next day, he had barely had time to wish her happy Christmas and to tell her that some very important news when they got back from the holidays. He was not entirely sure that she had heard him, though Ron and Lavender had been saying a thoroughly non-verbal goodbye just behind him at the time. Still, even Hermione would not be able to deny one thing. Malfoy was definitely up to something, and Snape knew it. So Harry felt fully justified in saying, I told you so, when he had done several times to Ron already. Harry did not get a chance to speak to Mr. Weasley, who was working very long hours in the ministry until Christmas Eve night. The Weasleys and their guests were sitting in the living room, which Ginny had decorated so lavishly that it was rather like sitting in a paper chain explosion. Fred, George, Harry, and Ron were the only ones who knew that the angel on top of the tree was actually a garden gnome and had bitten Fred on the ankle when he'd pulled up carrots for Christmas dinner. Stupefied, painted gold, and stuffed into a miniature tutu with small wings glued to its back, it glowered down at them all, the ugliest angel Harry had ever seen, with a large bald head like a potato and rather hairy feet. They were all supposed to be listening to a Christmas broadcast by Mrs. Weasley's favourite singer, Celestina Warbeck, whose voice was warbling out of the large wooden wireless. Fleur, who seemed to find Celestina very dull, was talking so loudly in the corner that a scowling Mrs. Weasley kept pointing her wand at the volume control, so that Celestina grew louder and louder. Under cover of a particularly jazzy number called A Cauldron Full of Hot, Strong Love, Fred and George started a game of exploding snap with Ginny. Ron kept shooting Bill and Fleur covert looks, so he was hoping to pick up tips. Meanwhile, Remus Lupin, who was thinner and more ragged-looking than ever, was sitting beside the fire, staring into its depths as though he could not hear Celestina's voice. Oh, come and stir my cauldron, and if you do it right, I'll boil you up some hot, strong love to keep you warm tonight. We danced to this when we were 18, said Mrs. Weasley, wiping her eyes on her knitting. Do you remember, Arthur? Hmm? Said Mr. Weasley, who had been nodding off over the satsuma he was peeling. Oh, yes, marvellous tune. With an effort, he sat up a little straighter and looked around at Harry, who was sitting next to him. Sorry about this, he said, jerking his head over to the wireless as Celestina broke into a chorus of Be Over Soon. No problem, said Harry, grinning. He had been busy at the... has it been busy at the Ministry? Very, said Mr. Weasley. I wouldn't mind if we were getting anywhere. But of the 3 arrests we've made in the last couple of months, I doubt any of them is a genuine Death Eater. Don't repeat that, Harry, he said quickly, looking more awake all of a sudden. They're not still holding Stan Shunpike, are they? Asked Harry. I'm afraid so, said Mr. Weasley. I know Dumbledore tried appealing directly to Scrimger about Stan. I mean, anybody who's actually interviewed him agrees he's about as much as a Death Eater as this Satsuma. But the top levels want to look as though they're making some progress, and 3 arrests sounds better than 3 mistaken arrests and releases. But again, that's all top secret. I won't say anything, said Harry. He hesitated for a moment, wondering how best to embark on what he wanted to say. As he marshalled his thoughts, Celestina Warbeck began a ballad of You charmed the heart right out of me. Mr. Weasley, you know what I told you in the station when we were setting off to school? I checked, Harry, said Mr. Weasley at once. I went and searched the Malfoy's house. There was nothing there either, broken or whole. Couldn't have been there. Yeah, I know, but I saw in the prophet that you looked. But is this... but this is something different. Well, something more. He told Mr. Weasley everything he'd heard between Malfoy and Snape. As Harry spoke, he saw Lupin's head turn a little towards him, taking in every word. When he'd finished, there was silence, except for Celestina's crooning. Oh, my poor heart, where has it gone? It's left me for a spell. Has it occurred to you, Harry, said Mr. Weasley, that Snape was simply pretending to offer help so he could find out what the Malfoys were up to? Harry said quickly. Yeah, I thought you'd say that. But how do we know? It isn't our business to know, said Lupin unexpectedly. He turned his back to the fire now and faced Harry across Mrs. Weasley, or Mr. Weasley. It's Dumbledore's business. Dumbledore trusts Severus. That ought to be good enough for all of us. But, said Harry, just say Dumbledore's wrong about Snape. People have said it many times. It comes down to whether or not you trust Dumbledore's judgment. I do, therefore I trust Sirius. But Dumbledore can make mistakes, Harry argued. He says it himself. And you, he looked Lupin straight in the eye, do you honestly like Snape? I neither like nor dislike Severus, said Lupin. No, Harry, I am speaking the truth, he added when Harry pulled a sceptical expression. We shall never be bosom friends, perhaps, after all that happened between James and Sirius and Severus. There's too much bitterness there. But don't forget that during the year that I taught Hogwarts, Severus made the Wolfsbane potion for me every month, made it perfectly, so I didn't have to suffer as I usually do at the full moon. But he accidentally let slip that you were a werewolf, so you had to leave, Harry said angrily. Lupin shrugged. The news would have leaked out anyway. We both know he wanted my job. But he could have wreaked so much worse damage on me by tampering with the potion. He kept me healthy. I must be grateful. Maybe he didn't dare mess with the potion with Dumbledore watching him, said Harry. You are determined to hate him, Harry, said Lupin with a faint smile. And I understand, with James as your father, with Sirius as your godfather. You've inherited an old prejudice. By all means tell Dumbledore what you've told Arthur and me, but do not expect him to share your view on the matter. Do not expect him to be surprised by what you tell him. It might have been on Dumbledore's orders that Severus questioned Draco. And now you've torn it quite apart. I'll thank you to give back my heart. Celestina ended her song on a very long, high-pitched note, and loud applause issued in the wireless, which Miss Weasley joined in enthusiastically. Is it over? Said Fleur loudly. Thank goodness. What an horrible. Shall we have the nightcap then? Said Mr. Weasley loudly, leaping to his feet. Who wants eggnog? What have you been up to lately? Harry asked Lupin, as Mr. Weasley bustled off to fetch the eggnog and everyone else stretched and broke into conversation. Oh, I've been underground, said Lupin. Almost literally. That's why I haven't been able to write, Harry. Sending letters to you would have been something of a giveaway. What do you mean? I've been living amongst my fellows, my equals, said Lupin. Werewolves, he added, at Harry's look of incomprehension. Nearly all of them are on Voldemort's side. Dumbledore wanted a spy, and I was ready-made. He sounded a little bitter, and perhaps realized this, for he smiled more warmly as he went on. I'm not complaining. It is necessary to work, and who can do it better than I? However, it's been difficult gaining their trust. I bear the unmistakable signs of having tried to live among wizards, you see, whereas they have been shunned by normal society and live on the margins, stealing, sometimes killing to eat. How come they like Voldemort? They think that, under his rule, they'll have a better life, said Lupin. It's hard to argue with Greyback out there. Who's Greyback? You haven't heard of him? Said Lupin, his hands closed convulsively in his lap. Fenrir Greyback is perhaps the most savage werewolf alive today. He regards it as his mission in life to bite and to contaminate as many people as possible. He wants to create enough werewolves to overcome the wizards Voldemort has promised him prey in return for his services. Greyback specializes in children. Bite 'em young, he says, and raise them away from their parents. Raise them to hate normal wizards. Voldemort has threatened to unleash him upon people's sons and daughters. It's a threat that usually produces good results. Lupin paused and said, It was Greyback who bit me. What? Said Harry, astonished. When you were a kid, you mean? Yes, my father had offended him. I did not know for a very long time the identity of the werewolf who had attacked me. I even felt pity for him, thinking he had no control, knowing by then how it felt to transform. But Greyback is not like that. At the full moon he positions himself close to his victims, ensuring that he's near enough to bite. He plans it all, and this man Voldemort is using to marshal the werewolves. I cannot pretend that my particular brand of reasoned argument is making much headway against Greyback's insistence that we werewolves deserve blood, and we ought to revenge ourselves on normal people. But you are normal, said Harry fiercely. You've just got a problem. Lupin burst out laughing. Sometimes you remind me a lot of James. He called it my furry little problem in company. Many people were under the impression I owed a badly behaved rabbit. He accepted a glass of eggnog from Mr. Weasley with a word of thanks, looking slightly more cheerful. Harry, meanwhile, felt a rush of excitement. This last mention of his father, had reminded him that it was something that he'd been looking forward to asking Lupin. Have you ever heard of someone called the Half-Blood Prince? The Half-Blood what? Prince, said Harry, watching him closely for signs of recognition. There are no wizarding princes, said Lupin, now smiling. Is this the title you were thinking of adopting? I would have thought the chosen one would have been enough. It's nothing to do with me, said Harry indignantly. The Half-Blood Prince is someone who used to go to Hogwarts. I've got his potions book. He wrote spells all over it, spells he invented. One of them was Levicorpus. Oh, that one uh, had a great vogue during my time at Hogwarts, said Lupin reminiscently. There were a few months in my 5th year when you couldn't move for being hoisted up in the air by your ankle. My dad used it, Harry said. I saw him in the pensive. He used it on Snape. He tried to sound casual, though it was the throwaway comment of no real importance. I was not sure it achieved the right effect. Lupin's smile was a little too understanding. Yes, he said, but he wasn't the only one. As I say, it was very popular. And you know these spells come and go. It sounded like it was invented while you were at school, Harry persisted. Not necessarily, said Lupin. Jinxes go in and out of fashion like everything else. He looked into Harry's face and then said quietly, James was a pure-blood, Harry, and I promise you he never asked us to call him Prince. Abandoning pretense, Harry said, And it wasn't serious, are you? Definitely not. Oh, said Harry, staring into the fire. I just thought, well, he's helped me out in a lot of potion classes, the prince has. How old is this book, Harry? Dunno, I've never checked. Well, perhaps we'll give you a clue as to when the prince was at Hogwarts, said Lupin. Shortly after this, Fleur decided to imitate Celestina singing A Cauldron Full of Hot, Strong Love, which was taken by everyone, once they glimpsed Miss Weasley's expression, to be a cue to go to bed. Harry and Ron climbed all the way up to Ron's attic bedroom, where a camp bed had been added for Harry. Ron fell asleep almost immediately, but Harry delved into his trunk and pulled out a copy of Advanced Potion Making before getting into bed. There he turned its pages searchingly until he finally found, at the front of the book, the date that had been published was nearly 50 years old. Neither his father nor his friends, or his father's friends, had been at Hogwarts 50 years ago. Feeling disappointed, Harry threw the book back into the trunk, turned off the lamp, and rolled over, thinking of werewolves and Snape, Stan Shunpike and the Half-Blood Prince, and finally falling into an uneasy sleep full of creeping shadows and the cries of bitten children. She's got to be joking. Harry woke with a start to find a bulging stocking lying over the end of his bed. Apologies for the pause there. He put on his glasses and looked around. The tiny window was almost completely obscured with snow, and in front of it, Ron was standing bolt upright in bed, examining what appeared to be a thick gold chain. "What's that?" asked Harry. "It's from Lavender," said Ron, sounding revolted. "She can't honestly think I'd wear." Harry looked more closely and let out a shout of laughter. Dangling from the chain was the large letters with the words, "My sweetheart." "Nice," he said. "Classy. You should definitely wear that in front of Fred and George." "If you tell them," said Ron, shoving the necklace out of sight under his pillow. I'll stutter at me," said Harry, grinning. "Come on, would I?" "How could you think I'd like something like this, though?" Ron demanded of thin air, looking rather shocked. "Well, think back," said Harry. "Have you ever let it slip that you'd like to go out in public with the words 'My sweetheart' around your neck?" "Well, we don't really talk much," said Ron. "It's mainly—" "Snogging," said Harry. "Well, yeah," said Ron, hesitating a moment, and then, "Is Hermione really going out with McLaggen?" "I don't know," said Harry. "They were at Slughorn's party together, but I don't think it went that well." Ron looked slightly more cheerful as he delved deeper into his stocking. Harry's presents included a sweater with a large golden snitch, worked on to the front, hand knitted by Mrs. Weasley, a large box of Weasley's Wizard Weezers, produced from the twins, or products from the twins, and a slightly damp, mouldy smelling package which came with the label reading, "To Master, from Creature." Harry stared at it. "Do you reckon this is safe to open?" he asked. "Can't be anything dangerous. All our mails being searched by the Ministry," replied Ron, as though he was, although he was eyeing the parcel suspiciously. "I didn't think of giving Creature anything. Do people normally give their house elves Christmas presents?" asked Harry, prodding the parcel cautiously. "Hermione would," said Ron. "But let's wait and see what it is before you start feeling guilty." A moment later, Harry had given a loud yell and leapt out of his camp bed. It contained a large number of maggots. "Nice," said Ron, roaring with laughter. "Very thoughtful." "I'd rather them than the necklace," said Harry, which sobered Ron up at once. Everyone was wearing new sweaters when they all sat down for Christmas lunch, everyone except Fleur, on whom, it appeared, Miss Weasley had not wanted to waste one, and Mrs. Weasley herself, who was sporting a brand new midnight blue witch's hat, glittering with what looked like tiny starlight diamonds, and a spectacular golden necklace. "Fred and George gave them to me. Aren't they beautiful?" "We find we appreciate you more and more, Mum, now that we're washing our own socks," said George, waving an airy hand. "Parsnips, Remus?" "Harry, you've got a maggot in your hair," said Ginny cheerfully, leaning across the table to pick it out. Harry felt goosebumps erupt around his neck. Nothing to do with the maggot. Oh, horrible, said Fleur, with an affected little shudder. Isn't it? Said Ron. Gravy, Fleur. In his eagerness to help her, he knocked over the gravy boat. Bill waved his wand, and the gravy soared up into the air and returned meekly to the boat. You are as bad as that, Tonks, said Fleur to Ron, when she had finished kissing Bill in thanks. She is always knocking. I invited dear Tonks to come along today, said Mrs. Weasley, setting down the carrots with unnecessary force and glaring at Fleur. But she wouldn't come. Have you spoken to her lately, Remus? No, I haven't been in contact with anybody very much, said Lupin. But Tonks has her own family to go to, hasn't she? Said Mrs. Weasley. Maybe. I got the impression she was planning to spend Christmas alone, actually. She gave Lupin an annoyed look, as though it was all his fault. She was getting Fleur as for a daughter-in-law instead of Tonks. But Harry glanced across at Fleur, who was now feeding Bill bits of turkey off her own fork. And thought that Mrs. Weasley was fighting a long-lost battle. He was, however, reminded of a question he had in regard to Tonks, and who better to ask than Lupin, the man who knew all about Patronuses. Tonks's Patronus has changed form, she told him. Or he told him. Snape said so anyway. I don't know. I didn't know that could happen. Why would your Patronus change? Lupin took his time chewing his turkey and swallowed before saying slowly, Sometimes a great shock, an emotional upheaval. It looked big, and it had 4 legs, said Harry, struck by a sudden thought, lowering his voice. Hey, it couldn't be... Arthur, said Miss Weasley suddenly, as she had risen from her chair. Her arm was pressed over her heart as she was staring out the kitchen window. Arthur, it's Percy! What? Mr. Weasley looked round. Everyone looked quietly at the window. Ginny stood up for a better view. There, sure enough, was Percy Weasley striding across the snowy yard, his horn-rimmed glasses glinting in the sunlight. He was not, however, alone. Arthur, he's with the minister. And sure enough, the man that Harry had seen at the Daily Prophet was following along in Percy's wake, limping slightly, his mane of greying hair, and his black cloak flecked with snow. Before any of them could say anything, before Mr. and Mrs. Weasley could do more than exchange stunned looks, the back door opened, and there stood Percy. There was a moment's painful silence. Then Percy said rather stiffly, Merry Christmas, Mother. Oh, Percy, said Miss Weasley, and threw herself into his arms. Rufus Scrimger passed in the doorway, leaning on his walking stick and smiling as he observed this affecting scene. You must forgive this intrusion, he said when Miss Weasley looked around at him, beaming and wiping her eyes at Percy. Percy and I were in the vicinity, working, you know, and I couldn't resist dropping in to see you all. But Percy showed no sign of wanting to greet any of the rest of the family. He stood poker straight and awkward looking as he stared over everyone else's heads. Mr. Weasley, Fred and George all observed him, stony-faced. Please come in. Sit down, Minister, fluttered Mrs. Weasley, straightening her hat. Have a perky, or some struding. I mean... No, no, dear Molly, said Scrimgeour. Harry guessed he had he had checked on her name with Percy before he'd entered the house. I don't want to intrude. I wouldn't be here at all if Percy didn't want to see you all so badly. Oh, Percy, said Mrs. Weasley tearfully, reaching up to kiss him. We're only looking in for 5 minutes, so I'll have to stroll around the yard while you catch up with Percy. No, no, I assure you I don't want to butt in. Well, if anyone cared to show me your charming garden. Ah, that young man's finished. Why don't you take a stroll with me? The atmosphere around the table changed perceptibly. Everyone looked from Scrimgeour to Harry. Nobody seemed to find Scrimgeour's pretense that they did not know Harry's name convincing, or find it natural that he should be chosen to accompany the minister around the garden when Ginny, Fleur, and George had also got clean plates. Yeah, all right, said Harry into the silence. He was not fooled, for all Scrimger's talk and being just in the area, that Percy wanted to look in on his family. This must be the real reason he wanted to come, so Scrimger could talk to Harry alone. It's fine, he said quietly, as he passed Lupin, who had half risen from his chair. Fine, he added, as Mr. Weasley opened his mouth to speak. Wonderful, said Scrimger, standing back to let Harry pass through the door ahead of him. We'll just take a turn around the garden, and then Percy and I will be off. Carry on, everyone. Harry walked across the yard, towards the Weasleys' overgrown, snow-covered garden, Scrimger limping slightly at his side. He had, Harry knew, been head of the Auror office, had been tough and battle-scarred, very different from the portly Fudge in his bowler hat. Charming, said Scrimger, stopping at the garden fence and looking over the snowy lawn and the indistinguishable plants. Charming. Harry said nothing. He could tell that Scrimger was watching him. I've wanted to meet you for a very long time, said Scrimger, after a few moments. Did you know that? No, said Harry truthfully. Oh yes, a very long time. But Dumbledore has been very protective of you, said Scrimger. Natural, of course. Natural after all you've been through, especially what happened at the Ministry. He waited for Harry to say something, but Harry did not oblige, so he went on. I've been hoping for an occasion to talk to you ever since I gained office, but Dumbledore has, most understandably, as I say, prevented this. Still Harry said nothing, waiting. The rumours that have flown around, said Scrimger. Well, of course, we know how these stories get distorted. All these whispers of a prophecy of you being the chosen one. They were getting very near now, Harry thought, the reason Scrimger was here. I assume that Dumbledore had discussed these matters with you? Harry deliberated, wondering whether he ought to lie or not. He looked at the little gnome prints all over the flower beds, and the scuffed-up patch that marked the spot where Fred had caught the gnome wearing the tutu in front, or at the top of the Christmas tree. Finally, he decided on the truth, or a bit of it. Yeah, we discussed it. Have you, said Scrimger. Harry could see out of the corner of his eyes Scrimger squinting at him, so he pretended to be very interested in a gnome that had just poked his head out from underneath a frozen rhododendron. And what has Dumbledore told you, Harry? Sorry, that's between us, said Harry. He kept his voice as pleasant as he could, and Scrimger's tone, too, was light and friendly, when he said, Oh, of course, it's a question of confidences. I wouldn't want you to divulge. No. And in any case, does it really matter whether you're the chosen one or not? Harry had to mull that one over for a few seconds before responding. I don't really know what you mean, Minister. Well, of course, to you it'll matter enormously, said Scrimger with a laugh, but to the wizarding community at large, it's all perception, isn't it? It's what people believe that's important. Harry said nothing. He thought he saw dimly where they were heading, but he was not going to help Scrimger get there. The gnome under the rhododendron was now digging for worms at its roots. Harry kept his eyes fixed upon it. People believe you are the chosen one, you see, said Scrimger. They think you're quite the hero, which of course you are, Harry, chosen or not. How many times have you faced he who must not be named now? Well, anyway, he pressed on, without waiting for a reply. The point is, you're a symbol of hope for many, Harry. The idea that there's somebody out there who might be destined to destroy he who must not be named, well, naturally it gives people a lift. And I can't help but feel that once you realise this, you might consider it, well, almost a duty to stand alongside the Ministry and give everyone a boost. The gnome had just managed to get a hold of the worm that was now tugging very hard on it, trying to get it out of the frozen ground. Harry was silent for so long that Scrimger said, looking from Harry to the gnome, Funny little chaps, aren't they? But what say you, Harry? I still don't understand exactly what you want, said Harry slowly. Stand alongside the Ministry? What does that mean? Well, nothing at all onerous, I assure you, said Scrimger. If you were to be seen popping in and out of the Ministry from time to time, for instance, that would give the right impression. And of course, if you were there, you would have ample opportunity to speak to Gawain Robards, my successor as head of the Auror office. Dolores Umbridge has told me you cherish an ambition to become an Auror. Well, that could be arranged very easily. Harry felt anger bubbling in the pit of his stomach. So Dolores Umbridge was still at the Ministry, was she? So basically, he said, and he wanted to clarify a few points, you'd like to give the impression that I'm working for the Ministry? It would give everyone a lift to think you were more involved, Harry, said Scrimgeour, sounding relieved that Harry had cottoned on so quickly. The chosen one, you know, it's all about giving people hope, the feeling that exciting things are happening. But if I keep running in and out of the Ministry, said Harry, still endeavouring to keep his voice friendly, won't that seem as though I approve of what the Ministry is up to? Well, said Scrimgeour, frowning slightly, well, yes, that's partly why we'd like. No, I don't think that'll work, said Harry pleasantly. You see, I don't like some of the things the Ministry's doing. Locking up Stan Shunpike, for instance. Scrimgeour did not speak for a moment, but his expression hardened instantly. I would not expect you to understand, he said. He was not successful in keeping anger out of his voice, as Harry had been. These are dangerous times, and certain measures need to be taken. You're 16 years old. Dumbledore's a lot older than 16, and he doesn't think Stan should be in Azkaban either, said Harry. You're making Stan a scapegoat, just like you want to make me a mascot. They looked at each other long and hard. Finally Scrimgeour said, with no pretence at warmth, I see. You prefer, like your hero Dumbledore, to disassociate yourself from the Ministry? I don't want to be used, said Harry. Some would say it's your duty to be used by the Ministry. Yeah, and others might say it's your duty to check people are really Death Eaters before you chuck them in prison, said Harry, his temper rising now. You're doing what Barty Crouch did. You never get it right, you people, do you? You've either got Fudge pretending everything's lovely and people get murdered right in front of his nose, or you've got you chucking the wrong people into jail and trying to pretend you got the chosen one working for you. So you're not the chosen one, said Scrimgeour. I thought you said it didn't matter anyway, said Harry with a bitter laugh. Not to you, anyway. I shouldn't have said that, said Scrimgeour quickly. It was tactless. No, it was honest, said Harry. One of the only honest things you've said to me. I don't really care, or you don't really care whether I live or die, but you do care that I want to help convince everyone you're winning the war against Voldemort. I haven't forgotten, Minister. He raised his fist. There, shining white on the back of his cold hand, were the scars in which Dolores Umbridge had forced him to carve into his own flesh. I must not tell lies. I don't remember you rushing to my defence when I was trying to tell everyone Voldemort was back. The Ministry was so keen, wasn't so keen to be pals last year. They stood in silence, as icy as the ground beneath their feet. The gnome that finally managed to extradite its worm was now sucking on it happily, leaning against the bottommost branches of the rhododendron bush. What is Dumbledore up to? Said Scrimgeour brusquely. Where does he go? When he's absent from Hogwarts? No idea, said Harry. And you wouldn't tell me if you knew, said Scrimgeour, would you? No, I wouldn't, said Harry. Well then, I shall have to see whether I can find out by other means. You can try, said Harry indifferently, but you seem to be cleverer than Fudge. So I thought you'd have learned from his mistakes, trying to interfere at Hogwarts. You might have noticed he's not still Minister anymore, but Dumbledore's still Headmaster. I'd leave Dumbledore alone if I were you. There was a long pause. Well, it's clear to me he's done a very good job on you, said Scrimgeour, his eyes cold and hard behind his wire-rimmed glasses. Dumbledore's man through and through, aren't you, Potter? Yeah, I am, said Harry. Glad we straightened that out. As he turned his back on the Minister of Magic, he strode back toward the house. End of chapter 16. Got chapter 17 coming up, A Sluggish Memory. I'm going to take a wee short break. Grab yourselves drink or tea, coffee, whatever you fancy. Quick break, be back in a few minutes. All right. Back with Harry Potter, the Half-Blood Prince. We're doing chapter 17, A Sluggish Memory. Late in the afternoon, a few days after the new year, Harry, Ron, and Ginny lined up beside the kitchen fire to return to Hogwarts. The Ministry had arranged this one-off connection to the Floo network to return students quickly and safely to the school. Only Mrs. Weasley was there to say goodbye, as Mr. Weasley, Fred, George, Bill, and Fleur were all at work. Mrs. Weasley dissolved into tears the moment of parting. Admittedly, it took very little to set her off lately. She'd been crying on and off ever since Percy had stormed off from the house on Christmas Day, with his glasses splattered with mashed parsnip, for which Fred, George, and Ginny all claimed credit. "Don't cry, Mum," said Ginny, patting her on the back as Miss Weasley sobbed into her shoulder. "It's okay." Yeah, don't worry about us, said Ron, permitting his mother to plant a very wet kiss on his cheek. Or about Percy. He's such a prat. It's not really a loss, is it? Mrs. Weasley sobbed harder than ever as she enfolded Harry in her arms. Promise me you'll look after yourself. Stay out of trouble. I always do, Mrs. Weasley, said Harry. I like a quiet life. You know me. She gave a watery chuckle and stood back. Be good then, all of you. Harry stepped into the emerald flame and shouted, Hogwarts! In the last fleeting view of Mrs. Weasley's kitchen, Miss Weasley's tearful face before the flames engulfed him, spinning fast, he caught blurred glimpses of other wizarding rooms, which were whipped out of sight before he could get a proper look, and then slowing down. Finally, he stopped squarely in the fireplace in Professor McGonagall's office. She barely glanced up from her work as he clambered out over the gate. Evening, Potter. Try not to get too much ash on the carpet. No, Professor. Harry straightened his glasses and flattened his hair as Ron came spinning into view. When Harry arrived, all three of them trooped out of McGonagall's office and off towards Gryffindor Tower. Harry glanced out of the corridor windows as they passed. The sun was already sinking over the grounds, carpeted in deeper snow than had lain over the Burrow garden. In the distance he could see Hagrid feeding Buckbeak in front of the cabin. Bobbles, said Ron confidently when they reached the fat lady. He was looking rather paler than usual and wincing at his loud voice. No, she said. What do you mean, no? There's a new password, she said, and please don't shout. But we've been away. How are we supposed to... Harry, Ginny. Hermione was hurrying towards them, very pink-faced and wearing a cloak, hat and gloves. I got back a couple of hours ago, and I've been down to visit Hagrid and Witherwings, she said breathlessly. Do you have a good Christmas? Yeah, said Ron at once. Pretty eventful. Rufus Grim... I've got something for you, Harry, said Hermione, neither looking at Ron nor giving any sign that she'd heard him. Oh, hang on. The password. Abstinence. Precisely, said the fat lady in a feeble voice, swung forward to reveal the portrait hole. What's up with her? Said Harry. Overindulged over Christmas, apparently, said Hermione, rolling her eyes as she led her way into the packed common room. She and her friend Violet drank their way through the wine in that picture of the drunk monks down in the Charms corridor. Anyway, she rummaged in her pocket for a moment, then pulled out a scroll of parchment with Dumbledore's writing on it. Great, said Harry, unrolling it at once to discover his next lesson with Dumbledore was scheduled for the following night. I've loads to tell him, and you. Let's sit down. But at that moment there was a loud squeal of "Won!" from Lavender Brown, who came hurtling out of nowhere and flung herself into Ron's arms. Several onlookers snickered. Hermione gave a tinkling laugh and said, There's a table over here. Coming, Ginny? No thanks, I need to meet Dean, said Ginny, although Harry could not help noticing it did not sound very enthusiastic. Leaving Ron and Lavender locked in a kind of vertical wrestling match, Harry led Hermione over to the spare table. So how was your Christmas? Oh, fine, she shrugged. Nothing special. How was it at Wan's? I'll tell you in a minute, said Harry. Look, Hermione, can't you... No, I can't, she said flatly, so don't even ask. I thought maybe, over Christmas. It was the fat lady who drank a vat of 500-year-old wine, Harry, not me. So what's this important news you want to tell me? She looked too fierce at the moment, so Harry dropped the subject of Ron and recounted all that had happened between Malfoy and Snape. When he had finished, Hermione sat and thought for a moment and then said, Don't you think he was pretending to offer help so he could trick Malfoy into telling him what he was doing? Well, yeah, said Hermione. Ron's dad and Lupin think so, said Harry grudgingly. But this definitely proves Malfoy's planning something. You can't deny that. No, I can't, she said slowly. And he's been acting on Voldemort's orders, just like I said. Did either of them actually mention Voldemort's name? Harry frowned, trying to remember. I'm not sure. Snape definitely said, your master, and who else would that be? I don't know, said Hermione, biting her lip. Maybe his father? She stared across the room, apparently lost in thought, not even noticing Lavender tickling Ron. How's Lupin? Not great, said Harry. He told her all about Lupin's mission among the werewolves and the difficulties he was facing. Have you heard of this Fenrir Greyback? Yes, I have, said Hermione, sounding startled. And so have you, Harry. When? History of Magic? You know full well I never listened. No, no, not the history of magic. Malfoy threatened Borgin with him, said Hermione. Back in Knockturn Alley, don't you remember? He told Borgin that Greyback was an old family friend and he'd be checking up on Borgin's progress. Harry gaped at her. I forgot. This proves Malfoy's a Death Eater. But how else could he have contact with Greyback? At telling him what to do? That is pretty suspicious, breathed Hermione. Unless... Oh, come on, said Harry in exasperation. You can't get round this one. Well, there is the possibility it was an empty threat. You're unbelievable, you are, said Harry, shaking his head. Well, we'll see who's right. You'll be eating your words, Hermione, just like the Ministry. Oh yeah, and I had a row with Rufus Scrimger as well. The evening passed most amicably, with both of them abusing the Minister of Magic. For Hermione, like Ron, had thought, after all the Ministry had put Harry through the previous year, that he had great nerve asking him to help now. The new term started the next morning with a pleasant surprise for the sixth years. A large sign had been painted across the common room boards overnight. Apparition lessons. If you're 17 years of age or will turn 17 before the 31st of August, you're eligible for a 12-week course of apparition lessons from the Ministry of Magic. Please sign below if you'd like to participate. Cost 12 galleons. That's cheap. That's cheaper than a driving lesson. Harry and Ron joined the crowd that was jostling around the notice, taking it in turns to write their names underneath. Ron was taking a quill out to sign after Hermione when Lavender crept up behind him, slipped her hands over his eyes and trilled, Guess who won one? Harry turned to see Hermione stalking off. He caught up with her, having no wish to stay behind with Ron and Lavender. But to his surprise, Ron caught up with them just a little way beyond the portrait hole. His ears were bright red and his expression was disgruntled. Without a word, Hermione sped up to walk with Neville. So, apparition, said Ron, his tone making it perfectly plain that Harry was not to mention what had just happened. Should be a laugh, eh? I don't know, said Harry. Maybe it's better when you do it yourself. I didn't enjoy it much when Dumbledore took me along for a ride. I forgot you'd already done it. I'd better pass my test first time, said Ron, looking anxious. Fred and George did. Took me 3 times to pass my driving test. No shame in failing. Charlie failed, though, didn't he? Yeah, but Charlie's bigger than me, Ron said with his arms out from his body as though he were a gorilla. So Fred and George didn't go on about it much. Not to his face, anyway. When did he take the actual test? Oh, sorry, when can we take the actual test? Soon as we're 17. That's only March for me. Yeah, but you wouldn't be able to apparate in here. Not in the castle. Not the point, is it? Everyone would know I could apparate if I wanted. Ron was not the only one excited at the prospect of apparition. All that day there was much talk about the forthcoming lessons. A great deal of store was set by being able to vanish and reappear at will. How cool would it be when we can just... Seamus clicked his fingers in order to indicate disappearance. Me cousin Fergus does it just to annoy me. You wait till I can do it back. He'll never have another peaceful moment. Lost in the visions of his happy prospect, he flicked his wand a little too enthusiastically, so that instead of producing a fountain of pure water, that was the object of the day's charms lesson, he let out a hose-like jet that ricocheted off the ceiling and knocked Professor Flitwick flat on his face. Harry's already apparated, Ron told the slightly abashed Seamus. after Professor Flitwick had dried himself off with a wave of his wand and set Seamus lines. I am a wizard, not a baboon brandishing a stick. Dumb, someone took him in a sidelong apparition, you know. Whoa, whispered Seamus, and he, Dean, and Neville put their heads a little closer to hear what apparition felt like. For the rest of the day, Harry was besieged with requests from the other 6 years to describe the sense of apparition. All of them seemed odd, rather than put off, when he told them how uncomfortable it was. He was still answering detailed questions at 10 to 8 that evening, when he was forced to lie and say that he needed to return a book to the library, so as to escape in time for his lesson with Dumbledore. The lamps in Dumbledore's office were lit, the portraits of the previous headmasters were snoring gently in their frames, and the pensive was ready upon the desk once more. Dumbledore laid his hands either side of it, the right one as blackened and burnt-looking as ever. It didn't seem to have healed at all, and Harry wondered, perhaps for the 100th time, what had caused such a distinctive injury. But he did not ask. Dumbledore had said he would know eventually, and there was, in any case, another subject he wanted to discuss. But before Harry could say anything about Snape and Malfoy, Dumbledore spoke. I hear you met the Minister of Magic for Christmas. Yes, said Harry. He's not very happy with me. No, sighed Dumbledore. He's not very happy with me either. We must not try to sink beneath our anguish, Harry, but battle on. Harry grinned. He wanted me to tell the wizarding community that the Ministry's doing a wonderful job. Dumbledore smiled. That was Fudge's idea originally, you know. During his last days in office, he was desperately trying to cling to the past, or to the post. He sought a meeting with you, hoping you could give him your support. After everything Fudge did last year, said Harry angrily. After Umbridge. I told Cornelius there would be no chance of it, but the idea did not die when he left his office. Within hours of Scrimgeour's appointment, we met and he demanded I arrange a meeting with you. So that's why you argued, Harry blurted out. It was in the Daily Prophet. The Prophet is bound to report the truth occasionally, said Dumbledore, if only accidentally. Yes, that's why we argued. It appears that Rufus has found a way to corner you at last. He accused me of being Dumbledore's man through and through. How very rude of him. I told him I was. Dumbledore opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. Behind Harry, Fawkes the Phoenix let out a low, soft, musical cry, and, to Harry's intense embarrassment, he suddenly realised Dumbledore's bright blue eyes looked rather watery, and hastily stared at his own knees. When Dumbledore spoke, however, his voice was quite steady. I'm very touched, Harry. Scrimgeour wanted to know where you go whenever you're not at Hogwarts, said Harry, still looking fixedly at his knees. Yes, he's been very nosy about that, said Dumbledore, now sounding cheerful. Harry thought it looked safe to look up again. He even attempted to have me followed. Amusing, really. He sent Dawlish to tail me. It wasn't kind. I'd already been forced to jinx Dawlish once. I did it again, with the greatest of regret. So they still didn't know where you go? Said Harry, hoping for more information on this intriguing subject. But Dumbledore merely smiled over the top of his half-moon spectacles. No, they don't, and the time is not quite right for you to know either. Now, I suggest we press on, unless there's anything else. There is actually, sir, said Harry. It's about Malfoy and Snape. Professor Snape, Harry? Yes, sir. I overheard them during Professor Snape's, or Professor Slughorn's party. Well, I followed them, actually. Dumbledore listened to Harry's story with an impassive face. When Harry finished, he did not speak for a few moments, and then said, Thank you for telling me this, Harry, but I suggest you put it out of your mind. I don't think that it is of any great importance. Not of great importance? Repeated Harry incredulously. Professor, did you understand? Yes, Harry, blessed as I am with extraordinary brain power, I understand everything you told me, said Dumbledore, a little sharply. I think you might even consider the possibility that I understood a bit more than you did. Again, I'm glad you've confided in me, but let me reassure you that you've nothing, or that nothing you have told me is anything. Hold on, we'll try that again. Again, I'm glad that you've confided in me, but let me reassure you that you have not told me anything that causes me disquiet. Harry sat in seething silence, glaring at Dumbledore. What was going on? Did this mean that Dumbledore had indeed ordered Snape to find out what Malfoy was doing? In which case he had already heard everything had told him from Snape? Was he just worried about what he'd heard and pretending not to be? So, sir, said Harry in what he hoped was a polite, calm voice, you definitely still trust. I've been tolerant enough to answer that question already, said Dumbledore. But he did not sound very tolerant any more. My answer has not changed. I should think not, said a snide voice. Phineas Nigellus was evidently only pretending to be asleep. Dumbledore ignored him. And now, Harry, I must insist we press on. I have more important things to discuss with you this evening. Hang on, I'm going to switch on a light. It's a bit dark in here. 2 seconds. Oh, oh, where were we? Harry sat there, feeling mutinous. How would it be if he refused to permit? How would it be if he refused to permit the change of subject? If he insisted upon arguing the case against Malfoy? As though he had read Harry's mind, Dumbledore shook his head. Ah, Harry, how often it happens, even between the best of friends. Each of us believes that what he has to say is more important than anything that the other might have to contribute. I don't think what you've got to say is unimportant, sir, said Harry stiffly. Well, you're quite right, because it is not, said Dumbledore briskly. I have 2 more memories to show you this evening, both obtained with enormous difficulty. And the second of them is, I think, the most important that I have collected. Harry did not say anything to this. He still felt angry at the reception of his confidences, but did not see what could be gained further by arguing. So, said Dumbledore in a ringing voice, we meet this evening to continue the tale of Tom Riddle, whom we left last lesson poised on the threshold of his first years at Hogwarts. You'll remember how excited he was to hear he was a wizard, that he refused my company on his trip to Diagon Alley, and I, in turn, warned him against continued thievery when he arrived at school. Well, the start of the school year arrived, and with it came Tom Riddle, a quiet boy in his second-hand robes, who lined up with the other first years to be sorted. He was placed in Slytherin House. Almost the moment the sorting hat touched his head, continued Dumbledore, moving his blackened hand toward the shelf over his head where the sorting hat sat, ancient and unmoving. How soon Riddle learned that the famous founder of his house could talk to snakes, I do not know. Perhaps that very evening. The knowledge can only have excited him and increased the sense of self-importance. However, if he was frightening or impressing fellow Slytherins with displays of Parseltongue in their common room, no hint of it reached the staff room. He showed no sign of outward arrogance or aggression at all. He was unusually talented and a very good-looking orphan. Okay, Dumbledore. He naturally drew attention and sympathy from the staff from the moment of his arrival. He seemed polite, quiet, thirsty for knowledge. Nearly all of them were most favourably impressed by him. Didn't you tell them, sir, what it had been like when you met him at the orphanage? No, I did not, though he had shown no hint of remorse. It was possible that he felt sorry for how he had behaved before, and was resolved to turn over a new leaf. I chose to give him that chance. Dumbledore paused and looked inquiringly at Harry, who had opened his mouth to speak. Here again was Dumbledore's tendency to trust people in spite of overwhelming evidence that they did not deserve it. But then Harry remembered something. You didn't really trust him, sir, did you? He told me, the riddle who came out of the diary said, Dumbledore never seemed to like me as much as the other teachers did. Let us say that I did not take it for granted that he was trustworthy, said Dumbledore. I had, as I have already indicated, resolved to keep a close eye upon him, and so I did. I cannot pretend that I gleaned a great deal of detail from my observations at first. He was very guarded with me. He felt, I am sure, that, in the thrill of discovering his true identity, he told me a little too much. He was careful never to reveal as much again, but he could not take back what he had let slip in his excitement, nor what Mrs. Cole had confided in me. However, he had the sense never to try and charm me, as he had charmed so many of my colleagues. As he moved up the school, he gathered about him a group of dedicated friends. I call them that, for want of a better word, although, as I have already indicated, Riddle undoubtedly felt no affection for any of them. They were a motley collection, a mixture of weak seeking protection, the ambitious seeking some shared glory, and the thuggish gravitating toward a leader who could show them more refined forms of cruelty. In other words, they were the forerunners of the Death Eaters, and indeed some of them became the first Death Eaters after leaving Hogwarts. Rigidly controlled by Riddle, they were never detected in open wrongdoing, although in their 7 years at Hogwarts they were marked by a number of nasty incidents to which they were never satisfactorily linked, but the most serious of which was the opening of the Chamber of Secrets, which resulted in the death of a girl. As you know, Hagrid was wrongly accused at that time. I've not been able to find many memories of Riddle at Hogwarts, said Dumbledore, placing his withered hand on the pensive. Few who knew him then were prepared to talk about him. They were too terrified. But I know what I found out after he left Hogwarts, after much painstaking effort, after tracing those few who could be tricked into speaking, after searching old records and questioning Muggle and wizards alike. To whom I could persuade to talk, told me that Riddle was obsessed with his parentage. This is understandable, of course. He'd grown up in an orphanage and, naturally, wished to know how he came to be about there. It seems that he'd searched in vain for some trace of Tom Riddle Senior on the shields in the trophy room, on the list of prefects in the old school records, and even in the books of wizarding history. Finally, he was forced to accept that his father had never set foot in Hogwarts. I believed that it was then when he dropped the name forever, assumed the identity of Lord Voldemort, and began his investigations into his previously despised mother's family, the woman whom, you will remember, he had thought could not be a witch as she had succumbed to a shameful human weakness of death. All he had to go on was the single name, Marvolo, which he knew from those who had ran the orphanage had been his mother's father's name. Finally, after a painstaking search through the old books of wizarding families, he discovered the existence of the Slytherin surviving line. In the summer of his 16th year, he left the orphanage, to which he returned annually, and set off to find his gaunt relatives. And now, Harry, if you will stand. Dumbledore rose, and Harry saw that he was once again holding a small crystal bottle filled with swirling, pearly memory. I was lucky to collect this, he said, as he poured the gleaming mass into the pensive, as you will understand when you have experienced it. Shall we? Harry stepped up to the stone basin and bowed obediently until his face sank beneath the surface of the memory. He felt the familiar sensation of falling through nothingness, and then landed upon a dirty stone floor into almost total darkness. It took him several seconds to recognize the place. By the time Dumbledore had landed beside him, the Gaunt's house was more indiscriminately filthy than anywhere Harry had ever seen. The ceiling was thick with cobwebs, the floor coated in grime, mouldy and rotting food lay upon the table amidst a mass of crushed pots. The only light came from a single guttering candle placed at the feet of a man with hair and beard so overgrown Harry could neither see his eyes nor his mouth. He was slumped in an armchair by the fire, and Harry wondered for a moment whether he was dead. But then there came a loud knock at the door, and the man jerked upright, awake, raising his wand in his right hand and a short knife in the other. The door creaked open, and there on the threshold, holding an old-fashioned lamp, stood a boy Harry recognized at once. Tall, pale, dark-haired and handsome, the teenage Voldemort. Voldemort's eyes moved slowly around the hovel and then found the man in the armchair. For a few seconds they looked at each other, and the man staggered upright, the many empty bottles at his feet clattering and tinkling across the floor. "You!" he bellowed. "You!" And he hurtled drunkenly at Riddle, wand and knife held aloft. "Stop!" Riddle spoke in Parseltongue. The man skidded to a halt, sending mouldy pots crashing to the floor. He stared at Riddle. There was a long silence where they contemplated each other. The man broke it. "You speak it." "Yes, I speak it," said Riddle. He moved forwards into the room, allowing the door to swing shut behind him. Harry could not help but feel resentful admiration for Voldemort's complete lack of fear. His face merely expressed disgust and perhaps disappointment. "Where is Marvolo?" he asked. "Dead," said the other. "Died years ago, didn't he?" Riddle frowned. "Who are you then?" "I'm Morphin, ain't I?" "Marvolo's son?" "Of course I am. Then—" Morphin paused the chair. Out of his dirty face, the better to see Riddle, Harry saw that he wore Marvolo's black stone ring in his hand. "I thought you was that muggle," whispered Morphin. "You look mighty like that muggle." "What muggle?" said Riddle sharply. "That muggle what my sister took a fancy to. That muggle that lives in the big house over the way," said Morphin, and he spat unexpectedly on the floor between them. "You look right like him, Riddle. But older now, ain't he? He's older than you, now I think of it." Morphin looked slightly dazed and swayed a little, still clutching the edge of the table for support. "He's come back, I see," he said stupidly. Voldemort was gazing at Morphin, although appraising his possibilities. He moved a little closer and said, "Riddle came back. Ah, he left and served her right, marrying filth," said Morphin, spitting on the floor again. "Robbed us mind before she ran off. Where's the locket, eh? Where's Slytherin's locket?" Voldemort did not answer. Morphin was working himself into a rage. He brandished the knife and shouted, "Dishonoured us, she did, that little slut, and who are you, coming here and asking questions, all that? It's over, isn't it? All over." He looked away, staggering slightly, and Voldemort moved forwards. As he did so, an unnatural darkness fell, extinguishing Voldemort's lamp and Morphin's candle, extinguishing everything. Voldemort's fingers closed tightly around Harry's arm, and they were soaring back to the present again. The soft golden light in Dumbledore's office seemed to dazzle Harry's eyes after the impenetrable darkness. "Is that all?" said Harry at once. "Why did it go dark? What happened?" "Because Morphin couldn't remember anything that happened from that point on," said Dumbledore, gesturing Harry back into his seat. He awoke the next morning, and he was lying on the floor, quite alone. Marvolo's ring had gone. Meanwhile, in the village of Little Hindleton, a maid was running along the high street, screaming that there were 3 bodies lying in the drawing-room of the big house. Tom Riddle Senior, his mother and father. Tom Riddle Senior, his mother and father. Wouldn't that be Tom Riddle Junior then? And the father would be Tom Riddle Senior? We implying that was the grandfather? The Muggle authorities were perplexed. As far as I am aware, they do not know to this day how the Riddles died, for the Avada Kedavra curse does not leave any sign or damage. The exception sits before me, Dumbledore added with a nod at Harry's scar. The Ministry, on the other hand, knew that this was a wizard's murder. They also knew that a convicted Muggle-hater lived across the valley from Riddle's house, a Muggle-hater who had already been imprisoned once for attacking one of the murdered people. So the Ministry called upon Morphin. They did not need to question him, to use Veritaserum or legitimacy. He admitted to the murder on the spot, giving details only the murderer would know. He was proud, he said, to have murdered the Muggles. He had been awaiting the chance for years, and he'd handed over the wand, which had proved at once to be the one that killed the Riddles, and he permitted himself to be led to Azkaban without a fight. All that disturbed him was the fact that his father's ring that had disappeared. "He'll kill me for losing it," he told his captors over and over again. "He'll kill me for losing the ring." And that, apparently, was all he ever said again. He lived out the remainder of his life in Azkaban, lamenting the loss of Marvolo's last heirloom, buried alongside. It is buried alongside the prison. Hold on. Lamenting the loss of Marvolo's last heirloom and is buried beside the prison alongside. That is a terrible sentence right there. And is buried beside the prison alongside the other poor souls who have expired within its walls. So Voldemort stole Morphin's wand and used it, said Harry, sitting up straight. That's right, said Dumbledore. We have no memories to show us this, but I think I could be barely sure what happened. Voldemort stupefied his uncle, took his wand, proceeded across the valley over to the big house over the way, and murdered the Muggle man who abandoned his witch mother and, for good measure, his Muggle grandparents, thus obliterating the last of the unnoteworthy Riddle line, and revenging himself upon the father who never wanted him. Then he returned to the Gaunt hovel, performed a complex bit of magic that would implant a false memory in his uncle's mind, laid Morphin's wand beside his unconscious owner, pocketed the ancient ring he wore, and departed. And Morphin never realised he hadn't done it? Never, said Dumbledore. He gave, as I say, a full and boastful confession. But he had his real memory in him all the time. Yes, but it took a great deal of skilled legitimacy to coax it out of him, said Dumbledore. And why should anyone delve further into Morphin's mind when he had already confessed to the crime? However, I wanted to secure a visit to Morphin in the last weeks of his life, by which time I was attempting to discover as much as I could before Voldemort's past. I extracted this memory with difficulty. When I saw what it contained, I attempted to use it to secure Morphin's release from Azkaban. Before the Ministry reached their decision, however, Morphin had died. But how come the Ministry didn't realise that Voldemort had done all that to Morphin? Harry said angrily. He was underage at the time, wasn't he? I thought they could detect underage magic. You're quite right. They can detect magic, but not the perpetrator. You will remember that you were blamed by the Ministry for the hover charm that was, in fact, cast by Dobby, growled Harry. The injustice still rankled. So if you're underage and you do magic inside an adult witch or wizard's house, the Ministry won't know. They will certainly be unable to tell who performed the magic, said Dumbledore, smiling slightly at the look of great indignation on Harry's face. They rely on witch and wizard parents to enforce their offspring's obedience while within their walls. It's not crazy. Not allowing them to do magic. Why would you get expelled whenever they're relying on parents to be like, child, don't do that. That's naughty. Oh, but Harry's accidentally, whatever, expulsion. Well, that's rubbish, snapped Harry. Look what happened here. Look what happened to Morphin. I agree, said Dumbledore. Whatever Morphin was, he did not deserve to die as he did. Blamed for the murders he did not commit. But it's getting late, and I want you to see this other member before we part." Dumbledore took from the inside pocket of another crystal phial, and Harry fell silent once more. Hold on, there's something crawling up my wall, and I will not have it in my house. Give me 2 seconds whilst I make sure this is nothing that deserves to be squished. Well, all I've accomplished there is that there is a crawling insect now somewhere in a pile of clothes. Well, we'll worry about that later. Only a few pages from the end here. Apologies for the interruption. Where did we get to? Harry noticed the contents proved difficult to empty into the Pensieve, as though they'd congealed slightly. Did memories go off? "This will not take long," said Dumbledore, when he had finally emptied the phial. "We shall be back before you know it. Once more into the Pensieve, then." And Harry fell again through the surface, landing this time in front of a man he recognised at once. It was a much younger Horace Slughorn. Harry was so used to him being bald that he found the sight of Slughorn with thick, shiny, straw-coloured hair quite disconcerting. It looked as though his head was thatched, though there was already a shiny galleon-sized bald patch on the crown. His moustache, less massive than it was these days, was gingery blonde, was not quite as rotund as the Slughorn Harry knew, although the gold buttons of his richly embroidered waistcoat were taking a fair amount of strain. His little feet resting upon a velvet poof. He was sitting well back in a comfortable winged armchair, one hand grasping a small wine glass, the other searching the box of a crystallized pineapple. Harry looked around as Dumbledore appeared beside him. He saw they were standing in Slughorn's office. A dozen boys were sitting around Slughorn, all on harder or lower seats than his, and all in their mid-teens. Harry recognised Riddle at once. He was the most handsome face, and he looked most relaxed of all the boys. His right hand lay negligently upon the arm of his chair. With a jolt, Harry saw he was wearing Marvolo's gold-black ring. He had already killed his father. "Sir, is it true Professor Merrythought is retiring?" Riddle asked. Tom, if I knew I couldn't tell you," said Slughorn, waving a reproving, sugar-coated finger at Riddle, though ruining the effect slightly by winking. "I must say, I'd like to know where you get your information, boy. More knowledgeable than half the staff you are." Riddle smiled. The other boys laughed and cast him admiring looks. "What with your uncanny ability to know things you shouldn't, and your careful flattery of people who matter. Thank you for the pineapple, by the way. You're quite right, it is my favourite." Several of the boys tittered. Something very odd happened, and the whole room was suddenly filled with a thick white fog, so Harry could only see the face of Dumbledore, who was standing beside him. Then Slughorn's voice rang out through the mist, unnaturally loudly. "You'll go wrong, boy. Mark my words." The fog cleared suddenly, as it had happened, and yet nobody made any allusion to it, nor did anybody look as though anything unusual had happened. Bewildered, Harry looked around at the small golden clock standing upon Slughorn's desk. It chimed 11 o'clock. "Good gracious, is that the time already?" said Slughorn. You better get going, boys, or we'll all be in trouble. Lestrange, I want your essay by tomorrow, or it's detention. Same goes for you, Avery. Slughorn pulled himself out of his armchair and carried his empty glass over to the desk as the boys filed out. Riddle, however, stayed behind. Harry could tell that he had dawdled deliberately, wanting to be the last in the room with Slughorn. Look sharp, Tom, Slughorn said, turning around and finding him still present. You don't want to be caught out of bed after hours, and you a prefect. Sir, I wanted to ask you something. Ask away then, my boy, ask away. Sir, I was wondering what you know about Horcruxes. And it happened all over again. The dense fog filled the room so that Harry could not see Slughorn or Riddle at all, only Dumbledore smiling serenely beside him. Then Slughorn's voice boomed out again, and all just as it had before. I don't know anything about Horcruxes, and I won't tell you if I did. Now get out of here at once, and don't let me catch you mentioning them again. Well, that's that, said Dumbledore placidly beside Harry. Time to go. And Harry's feet left the floor, to fall seconds later back on the rug in front of Dumbledore's desk. That's all there is, said Harry blankly. Dumbledore had said that this was his most important memory of all, but he couldn't see what was so significant about it. Admittedly, the fog and the fact that nobody seemed to have noticed it was odd, but rather than that, nothing had seemed to happen except Riddle ask a question and fail to get an answer. You might have noticed, said Dumbledore, reseating himself at the desk, that memory has been tampered with. Tampered with? Repeated Harry, sitting back down too. Certainly, said Dumbledore. Professor Slughorn has meddled in his own recollections. But why would he do that? Because, I think, he is ashamed of what he remembers, said Dumbledore. He tried to rework the memory, to show himself in a better light, obliterating those parts which he does not wish for me to see. That is, as you will have noticed, very crudely done, so that is all to the good, for that is all to the good. My goodness. For it shows that the memory is still there beneath the alterations. And so, for the first time, I'm giving you homework. Harry, this will be your first job. Persuade Professor Slughorn to divulge the real memory, which will undoubtedly be the most crucial part of information for all. Harry stared at him. But surely, sir, he said, keeping his voice as respectful as possible, you don't need me. You could use legitimacy or veritaserum. Professor Slughorn is an extremely able wizard. He will be expecting both, said Dumbledore. He is much more accomplished at occlumency than poor Morphin Gaunt, and I would be astonished if he not carried an antidote to veritaserum with him, since I coerced him to giving me that travesty of a recollection. No, I think it would be foolish to attempt to wrest the truth from Professor Slughorn by force. I might do much more harm than good. I do not wish to make him leave Hogwarts. However, he has his weaknesses, like the rest of us, and I believe that you are the one person who might be able to penetrate his defences. It is most important that we secure the true memory, Harry. How important we will only know when we've seen the real thing. So, good luck and good night. A little taken aback by the abrupt dismissal, Harry got to his feet quickly. Good night, sir. As he closed the study door behind him, he distinctly heard Phineas Nigella say, I can't see why the boys should be able to do it better than you, Dumbledore. I wouldn't expect you to, Phineas, said Dumbledore, and Fawkes gave another low, musical cry. Well, end of chapter 17. Right, I don't know how much my voice is going to be able to take. I might leave it there for tonight. Thank you for listening. I don't know if I'll be on later. Be trying to look into possibly streaming games. I know it's a bit cliche, isn't it? Everyone does it, but it would still be helping myself get into reading, wouldn't it? But we'll leave it there anyway. Thanks for listening.